Welcome to Your Family's Health, the program that focuses on healthcare issues with unique and different modalities for taking charge of your health today. Experts talk weekly with our continuing roster of guests from around the country and right here in Nassau County to keep you up to date on the latest health issues and trends. Take care of your mind, body, and soul. Spend the next half hour with the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC, and get on the journey to better health.
Hello and welcome to Your Family's Health. My name is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard from the nursing department here at Nassau Community College. Today you're going to learn about eating disorders, a far too common problem on Long Island and throughout our country. New research shows that 9% of the United States population, or nearly 30 million Americans, will have an eating disorder at some point in their lifetime. My guest today wrote a book about her personal experience with an eating disorder called Full: Overcoming Our Eating Disorders to Fully Live. I'd love to welcome the author, Alayna Burke, and she will be joining us here on Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Welcome, Alayna.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
So, Alayna, start with telling us a little bit about your story.
Yeah, so I'm currently 20 years old as of today. It's my birthday.
Oh, happy birthday.
Thank you. But my eating disorder, namely anorexia, started when I was 16 years old, so just 4 years ago. But there were a lot of instances leading up to my eating disorder, and it actually stemmed from anxiety and depression, which is very common, as we all know. But there were a lot of instances in my childhood where I learned that my body was a problem and that being smaller would mean that I was loved or that I was worthy. For example, I went to a doctor's appointment when I was 10 years old, just for a normal routine checkup. And when I got to the doctor's office, he was analyzing my height and weight growth chart. And I was in kind of an awkward preteen phase. So I was still going through growth spurts, and if you looked at me, you could say maybe I was a little bit chubby, but not anything that was medically a problem at all. But the doctor took a deep breath and he said, "Sweetheart, you might want to lay off the snacks." And that was the first time I remember thinking that I could control my life by controlling my food. And that's just one of many stories where I associated being smaller with being worthy. But yeah, it started around 10 years old for me.
So just for the listening audience, can you just tell us or explain the difference between anorexia nervosa, bulimia, and your diagnosis?
Yes. So I was diagnosed with anorexia, and anorexia is characterized by a significantly low body weight, the obsessive thoughts about food, and excessive exercise in attempt to lose weight. And a lot of times hospitalization is required for recovery, but luckily I decided to kind of turn my life around right before my dietitian was deciding to send me to treatment. So I just stayed in outpatient therapy, but my co-author, Melissa, struggled with bulimia in her teens and anorexia in her 30s. Bulimia is characterized by binging and purging, which is binging on food because you've been restricting. And then the purging is, induced vomiting or excessive exercise. So they're very similar in a lot of ways. But yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
It does. Can you just share with us what was the weight loss? What was your starting weight? And then as the condition progressed, how much weight did you lose?
I actually don't know. And the reason I don't know and the reason that I don't want to share that is because I know that people obsess over the numbers. There are people like me who will hear those numbers and think, okay, that's what I'm going to shoot for. And so I was never told. When I would go into my dietitian's office, I would face backwards on the scale. I don't know my weight today. I threw away my scale, and that's been a really, really helpful part of my recovery.
So how were you diagnosed?
So I was first diagnosed by, I was in therapy before I was diagnosed with anorexia. I was in therapy for anxiety and depression, but the anxiety and depression turned into a lot of thoughts and actions surrounding food and exercise. And that's when I started seeing a dietitian. But she diagnosed me with anorexia when I hit a certain body mass index. And again, I don't know those numbers for my own safety.
Okay.
But yes, there is definitely a BMI requirement, but as well as a psychological component that went into my diagnosis.
So what was the behavior associated with what the doctor had said in terms of saying that you were anorexic? Some behavior that you can share? So first of all, I was isolating myself. That was probably the biggest red flag. I completely cut off all of my friends. I was in high school, and I just was afraid to go out. I was afraid to go to the grocery store. I was afraid to get out of the house because I didn't want people to see my body. So isolation for sure. I wore a lot of baggy clothing to kind of cover up my body, and that's something you'll see that happens a lot with anorexia. I was exercising way more than was healthy for me. And the exercise was coming from a place of self-hate, of, wanting to burn calories, wanting to get smaller. I was obsessed with cooking, actually. And that's an interesting thing that people see with eating disorders, and it can be confusing. But I was so restrictive with my food that it was all I could think about. And it's all that I wanted to look at. I would scroll through Instagram and look at pictures of food and cook food, but not eat it. I was obsessed with food, but wasn't allowing myself to have it. So those are a few of my behaviors. So when you say excessive exercising, give me a typical day or week. How many days would you exercise and how long?
Again, that's something that I don't want people to take for themselves. I was running a lot. I was afraid of doing any strength training because I was afraid of building too much muscle. So a lot of cardio, going to the gym when I was tired, or making sure that I was always standing and not sitting. But I don't want to share the exact hours because, one, I don't know for sure. And two, I don't want it to be triggering.
So your obsession with cooking, what do you think it was an obsession with the cooking? Was it because the control in cooking and not eating? What was the connection there?
Again, I was just obsessed with food because the mind is amazing. And when you restrict your food intake, it goes into survival mode. It goes into starvation mode, and it will try its very hardest to get its hands on food. And so I wanted to smell the food. I wanted to look at it. My brain was asking me, begging me to eat. And I was just restricting, or sometimes I would binge on the food that I cooked. But yeah, it was an interesting psychological reaction.
So when you looked at yourself in the mirror, did you see yourself as fat or pudgy or chubby, as the word you used? Or how did you view yourself when you looked at your body? One
of our chapters in our book is about body image, and we talk about body dysmorphia, which is actually a separate diagnosis that neither my co-author or I were diagnosed with, but it's definitely something that I relate to. So body dysmorphia is basically looking at yourself in the mirror and not seeing yourself the way you actually appear. And for me, that looked like looking in the mirror. I was severely underweight, but I saw myself as fat. I saw myself as having too much on my stomach, too much on my legs. I couldn't look in the mirror without crying. It was devastating to look in the mirror. But something that helped me kind of get over that is mirror affirmations. And again, that's something I share in the book. But I learned from therapy to, stand in the mirror until I could say something about myself that I really loved, and something that wasn't superficial. And so I would find things like, I love my smile. And even if I didn't believe it in the moment, I would force myself to repeat that over and over in the mirror. And that helped immensely.
So tell me, at what point did your behavior become concerning? Was it concerning to your parents first and then to you, or to you and then your parents, and then that's what prompted seeking help?
Yeah. So luckily, I have very supportive parents, and they're very involved in my life. So I would say we noticed about the same time. I noticed about around the same time as my parents noticed. But I was playing volleyball at the time before I went into therapy. And I started getting panic attacks during volleyball tournaments. And that was very unlike me. I was very serious about the sport. I loved playing it. But I was having these panic attacks, and I would run off the court in the middle of a game. And just overwhelming anxiety, my heart beating out of my chest. I would try to pull my hair out because I didn't know why I was so stressed. And eventually that kind of anxiety turned into trying to control my food so that I could somehow feel better. I thought that was how I could feel better. But the first night that I told my parents I needed help was a few weeks after those panic attacks were regular. I was sitting down in my family room with them, and I said, Mom and Dad, I'm really scared for myself, and kind of like broke down in front of them. And, they looked at me and said, okay, I think it's time that we get you some help. So I'm very blessed with parents who try to understand me.
That's awesome. You're listening to Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard, and today you're learning about an eating disorder, anorexia. My guest, Alayna Burke, author of Full: Overcoming Our Eating Disorders to Fully Live. So, Alayna, this is very compelling for me. Tell me, does this disease, and is it okay that I call it a disease?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I'm not a medical professional, and I'm only 20 years old. But I more often hear it being called a psychological disorder. And would you say that this problem goes away, or will this affect you, do you think, the rest of your life? That is a great question. There are a lot of different takes on that. My take is that I am fully recovered. I choose to say that I'm fully recovered from anorexia, but there are often times in my life, and my co-author touches on this too, there are times in our lives when we feel that overwhelming stress. Life happens, it gets in the way. And sometimes that voice in our head says, step back into the depths of your eating disorder. You can gain that control back if you just restrict your food again. And so that voice will always be a part of my thoughts. But the difference now is that I no longer act on those thoughts.
So what is the best way to talk to someone that you think or realize that they have this kind of disorder? What worked for you? How should people talk to someone that they think has this disorder?
Right. It's very confusing because it is a very isolating disorder. And I was very ashamed of it. I think that's a common thing. People are ashamed to admit that they're struggling. But I really wanted people to ask me and check in on me, ask me if I was okay. And I know that sounds very simple, but those small words moved mountains for me. Knowing that the people around me were noticing me they were seeing my struggle was huge. And that was part of the eating disorder itself. Trying to make my body smaller was my way of communicating that I was struggling with anxiety. I wanted people to see that I was sick. So yeah, any way that people can show, I care about you, I'm here for you. That was always helpful.
As a teen, how has media impacted your self-image to even want to become or look smaller? How do you think the magazines, the social media, which is so prevalent and a part of what every teen's life?
Yeah, that is a huge factor. And it's interesting because my co-author is in her 50s. So she grew up in the late 1960s, early 70s.
Twiggy era, yeah.
Right. So she grew up around a lot of diet pill commercials, that kind of media, and like the home exercise revolution. And that impacted her. But my form of media was these edited pictures of women that I would often see, and I didn't know that they were edited pictures. I had this image encrypted in my mind of the ideal body type, and that was thin and, toned. So that definitely played a huge role in my eating disorder.
So what do you think? Do you think that someone who is a normal, quote unquote, right, BMI, body size, can they also have an eating disorder?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And oftentimes that's what you'll see. I mean, there's definitely the extreme where somebody's underweight or overweight, and they'll have an eating disorder, but a lot of times you can't even tell.
So what was you talk about an individualized treatment plan. Is it that way? In other words, do they look at your socialization therapist and are able to prescribe something very individual for you to deal with this disorder?
Yes.
And what did that look like?
Yeah, treatment has really evolved over the years. My co-author, Melissa, went to the hospital when she was in her teens, struggling with bulimia. And when she writes about the stories of her experience in the hospital, it's a lot different than what treatment centers are like now. My treatment looked like having a therapist, a dietitian, and a psychiatrist. And I was in high school. I was still able to keep up with school and go to these 3 appointments per week. It was definitely a busy schedule, but it was very suited to my needs. And I would meet one-on-one with all of these professionals, and they would talk to each other to kind of see where I'm at. And actually my dietitian and therapist decided that inpatient treatment, so basically a hospital, was needed for me. And they gave me 3 weeks to improve before they would send me away. And I did improve, luckily, thankfully. And so I never went inpatient. But yeah, inpatient treatment centers now look like a lot of group therapy. So, they'll have a lot of girls in one center and they'll have group therapy sessions, and then they'll break off and do individuals. They'll have meals together, things like that.
So, coming from as a teenager, as you were looking at the population of teens in your school, about how many of your peers do you think have some or similar eating disorder? Did you see it in others that surrounded you in school?
All the time. Yep, it is way too many. And what I realized is, as soon as I started opening up about my struggle, and as soon as I, decided to write this book and publish it, the amount of women and girls that come up to me and say that they relate is mind-blowing. It's overwhelming.
Wow. You're listening to Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard, and today you're learning about an eating disorder, anorexia. My guest, Alayna Burke, author of Full Overcoming Our Eating Disorders to Fully Live. So, Alayna, this is so compelling. The book that you authored, what is your audience that you're trying to target with your book?
Mm-hmm. We did a lot of work just coming up with our specific audience, especially because this is a multi-generational perspective with Melissa in her 50s and me just now turning 20. But our audience that we narrowed down is young women and girls struggling with an eating disorder and those who love them. Because this book isn't just for those struggling with this topic. My mom, my dad always wished they had a book like this where they could learn, kind of like get inside of my head and try to understand me better. So that's also who this book is for.
Do you think that this disorder is most commonly in females than males? What are your thoughts about that? Mm-hmm.
I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I know that the statistics,
That's fine.
are that more women struggle than men.
What are your thoughts about that? Why? Why do you think it's more in women?
That is a great question. I think there's just more pressure on women to look a certain way. And the certain look that women are pressured to have is a smaller body. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what models look like. And I really love, the movement in modeling where, they'll feature normal body types. But yeah, I think that women are constantly presented with the image of a smaller frame, of being fragile. And there's a chapter in our book called Be a Lady. And that's probably one of our most passionate chapters because I have a muscular build and I was born that way. And I used to be very proud of it as a kid. But the more I grew up, the more I was told through media that I wasn't supposed to look that manly. I wasn't supposed to have that muscle. I'm supposed to be fragile. I'm supposed to be delicate. I'm supposed to be a lady.
Wow. And so with that, what would you say is the correct etiquette words to use? Because I know parents sometimes in their rearing or raising their children, daughters or boys or girls, have certain things that they say which may be triggers or ways that push their children over the edge to this kind of disorders. What can be the etiquette words that we should stay away, or phrases that we should stay away from?
Right. That's interesting. I think that a safe way to approach that is just avoiding specific comments on young people's bodies, because it really doesn't matter. And at young ages, we're growing up, we're growing out. It's awkward. But it's natural, and commenting on a young child's body saying, oh, you're so tiny, that, what's the purpose behind that? Or, I had a PE teacher that one summer I lost a little bit of weight because I had a growth spurt and I didn't even notice. And she said, wow, you look so much better now that you've lost that weight. And those are things that really stuck with me. And, at young ages, we're very impressionable. So I think that we should really start to avoid specific body comments.
Yeah. So, okay, going to restaurants, for example, with your family or friends that understand that you had this disorder, is there ever an issue with you ordering certain things? And do you have certain feelings when you're around friends who may be aware that you have or had this disorder? What is your suggestions or recommendations? And tell me about your feelings.
Yeah, so with an eating disorder, there's often fear foods, we call them. And everybody has different fear foods. foods that bring up a lot of anxiety, foods that are quote unquote off limits, that don't fit within the rules of the eating disorder. And I still struggle with fear foods. But again, I don't actively restrict anymore. But I do notice those feelings come up. And when I'm with friends and family who know what I've gone through, what helps me is I kind of have a look that I give friends and family, and they're like, oh, like, I know that look. She's, struggling. And, maybe I have a friend who will sometimes shoot me a text, even if we're sitting next to each other, and she'll be like, I'm here for you, or like, I see you.
That's awesome.
Something simple like that. Or, my boyfriend knows me really well, and he knows that look, and he just knowing that he sees me is all that really matters.
What a great support system. So where can we find more information about your book? Where is it available?
Yeah, it is on Amazon and Barnes & Noble's website. Available as paperback and an ebook. We also have a website called blackumbrellawellness.com, where you can find the link to get the book, as well as a few other resources. And we are working on an audiobook version right now. So that'll be coming out later this year, hopefully by summertime.
Great. What is the one thing you want to leave with us when it comes down to your recovery from this eating disorder?
Yeah, I always want to tell people that recovery is absolutely possible. No matter how far you think you are, how stuck you feel, you can overcome it. Absolutely.
So thank you for being here, Alayna Burke, author of Full: Overcoming Our Eating Disorders to Fully Live. Thank you so much for bravely sharing your story with us and the rest of the world through your book. We really, really appreciate this journey.
Thank you.
This is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard from the nursing department here at Nassau Community College, and we want to thank you for listening to this week's edition of Your Family's Health.
We'd like to get your feedback on your family's health. Send your comments by emailing them to whpc@ncc.edu. Podcasts of today's show are available on iTunes, Android Podcasts, and Spreaker. This program was produced at the studios of Nassau Community College in cooperation with the nursing department. Join us next week for another edition of Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.